Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 1950s in American History and Memory, The Way We Never Were, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd just like to introduce the National Humanities Center to you. We're the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What that simply means is that we're an institute for advanced study, and we offer a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, to research and write on topics in the humanities, history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. And they write their books and articles in the warm confines of the Humanities Center. And ladies and gentlemen, we are distinctive among institutes for advanced study in that we offer a great deal of programs and resources for teaching American history and literature. You've discovered our webinars, and you can discover all the other things the Humanities Center offers for teachers by going to americainclass.org. That will take you to this page, and from this page, you can gain access to all of the resources that the Humanities Center offers for teachers. In addition, please check out our Pinterest page. There we aggregate our materials along with others and offer you some really rich resources for teaching American culture. You can keep up with the Humanities Center and what's going on in the education programs on our Facebook page, and now you'll be receiving from us a monthly newsletter that will provide you with lesson plans and resources. You'll hear about our upcoming webinars, and you'll explore what's happening more broadly at the Humanities Center. Now, after our program is over tonight, we urge you to go back to the 1950s in America website, where you went to get the materials for tonight's program. There you will find a recording of the webinar, the PowerPoint presentation, and an evaluation. Please feel free to use material from the PowerPoint presentation in your classes. That's what it's there for. And that evaluation is important to us. Please fill that out, shoot it back, and when you do that, you will be able to download a certificate of participation that you will be able to take to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation, I can really talk, I can honestly, your participation in this webinar warrants. So please fill out that evaluation. You can make sure that by doing that, you'll get your documentation of participation and get your CEU credit. Now, how do you participate? Well, our seminar leader tonight is going to be lecturing for a while. We'll stop, we'll ask some discussion questions. We hope that you'll respond to them by putting your cursor in that long, narrow box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Type your response. Hit that send button to the right. Your response will appear in the large chat box above, and I will bring it into the conversation at appropriate moments. But don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a question or you'd like to make a comment, please bring it into the conversation. I will notice it, and I will bring it into our webinar when I can, and you see the golden rule of our webinars there. The more you participate, the better the webinar. So let's get underway. We're very pleased to have with us tonight as our webinar leader, Volker Janssen, who is a professor at California State University at Fullerton. He has worked with teachers before in many Teaching American History grants in Illinois and California. He studies 20th century American history. In 2009, he brought out The Great Depression and the New Deal, a study guide. 2012, Where Minds and Matters Meet, Technology in California in the West, and soon to be published, Convict Labor, Civic Welfare, Prisons, and Rehabilitation in Mid-20th Century America. So, Volker, please tell us about mid-20th century America. What were the 50s really like?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for participating and for making this kind of event possible. It not only helps you develop your own professional training, it also actually gives us the opportunity to talk about what we do. So the NHC is doubly appreciated. What I want to ask the participants first is what they think of when they hear the 1950s. And what do your students think of when they hear the 1950s? What are sort of the key images or the key terms that come to mind for you? So I want to get a little bit of feedback there. Just a very sort of quick brainstorming, nothing too complicated.
Okay, we
Simple
have
times.
simple times, the Red Scare, prayer in schools. Let's see what else the 50s remind us of. In God We Trust. Consumerism, the Cold War, domesticity, Red Scare. I don't think my middle school students have much of a concept of this time. My parents' younger years, post-war stability, Ike Happy Days, Suburbia, Housewives, Happy Days. Your parents know the music, I suppose. Let's see. I was in grade school in the 50s. I just remember that baby boomers were born. Yeah, that's right. We were coming along. And let's see what else. Formative years for the baby boomers. Conformity. And we'll take a few more here. Oldies. Bomb scare. Yeah, let's see what. Elvis. All right. Okay, Volker, what do you make of these responses? Good old family dinners, and air raid sirens, and integration early on. Yeah, okay. What do you think, Volker? Well, let's see. What happened to Volker? Have we lost? Oh, okay. Volker, your mic is off. We've been having some connectivity problems here tonight, and we may be experiencing that right now. Let me ask our participants, can you folks hear me? Okay, yeah, yes, okay, Volker, you have fallen off the face of the earth here. You may have to go out and come back in. If you could exit. I can't get this. Let's see. Having a hard time getting this chat box. Oh, there we go. All right, now let's see if we can move this and find you. You don't seem to be. Let me see if we can find Volker. No, Volker, you're not on the board. So, I apologize for this, folks. We've been having some connectivity problems all night long. Volker, if you can hear me, okay, we'll send Volker this message and see if he can exit and come back in. And folks, I am really sorry for this. Let me make sure he is not listed on the board here. He is not. So if Volker could just exit and come back in, we'll get him back. There he is. Okay, let's make him the presenter. See if that works. Okay, Volker, if you could turn on your mic.
Okay, can you hear
there
me
you
again?
Are. We can
Hello,
hear you.
Okay, good.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, my apologies. I don't know what I did there. I'm sure.
No, you're probably no.
It's
but
okay.
I'm
sure it was my fault somewhere down the line.
No, we've had connectivity problems here tonight, so we've just fixed them. Okay, so you heard what our folks were talking about in their associations with the 50s in memory and history. What do you make of those?
Well, I think we have this bifurcated view of the 1950s as one of global anxiety on the one hand and a new era in domestic life on the other. I hear rock and roll, Bobby socks. I admit I don't even know what that is. So there is a consumer culture. There is a focus on family and prosperity at home, and on the other hand, there are the anxieties and fears of what's happening overseas. And there's actually a way in which we can sort of bring this all together in the way we think about the 1950s. Of course, central to the way we think about the 1950s is the way we frame it. What's the time period really? We have this sort of interesting relationship between the time periods and the actual dates, because the 60s aren't always exactly the 60s, and the 50s aren't always the 50s. Do we have the short 50s, that are just a couple of years in that decade, or are 1950s much longer? What kind of dates do you give the 1950s? Where do your 1950s begin?
Okay, where do your 1950s
I'm
begin,
asking
and what events?
the participants.
Right.
When do the 1950s
Yes.
begin? When do they end?
Okay. When do they begin? When do they end? And you might tell us too what events you think, if you think that way in terms of events, what events mark the beginning and the ending. Meanwhile, Volker, I will tell you that bobby socks were short white socks that women wore in lace-up shoes in the 1950s. Okay, end of World War II. That'd be 1945. That's my job here. Late 40s to the late 50s. I feel as if they ended with the Kennedy assassination. That's interesting. That's interesting. 50 to 60, there's a clean timeline. I always seem to bookend with post-war demobilization and the ascension of John Kennedy. So there's a 45 to 60 span again. We did a webinar on the 1960s, and that was a real fun parlor game to decide when the 60s began and when they ended. Most people put them about, say around 1963 to 1975, marking the beginning with the Kennedy assassination and ending with the American withdrawal from Vietnam. So, Volker, what do you think about this periodization?
Well, I think as technically clean as 1950 to 1960 is, the year 1950 marked the Korean War for sure, but was it really the beginning of a new era? That I'm not so sure of. The election of President Kennedy, in retrospect, seems like the beginning of something really new. But I would agree with one of the participants who suggested that maybe it was the Kennedy assassination that really marked the turning point and turned one public political culture into another. Did the 1950s begin with the end of World War II? In retrospect, it seems like a bit of a hassle to classify the post-war years of the late 40s into something separate. But there were important reorganizations happening politically and economically after World War II. Economically, the transition to a peacetime economy and the recognition that indeed that the country wasn't going to fall apart in the way that many nations had done after World War I. It proved that the New Deal coalition that Roosevelt had built would make it and would survive into and past the war years with Truman's embrace of a civil rights platform. So I think you could say that the beginning of the 1950s are kind of hard to pinpoint, and I would probably agree with one of the participants that maybe the 50s, the spell of the 50s, what we associate with the 50s, sort of was broken and ended with the assassination of Kennedy. But I think either way, in the way that we remember the 1950s, maybe the most important thing is that we know they ended with the 60s. And while our students may not have any particular association with the 1950s, I think there is a broader public concept of what the 60s were, and that was a time of discontent, of racial strife and conflict, of progressive political ideals aiming high and falling, of generational tension, of our international role becoming increasingly problematic. So the 1960s are sort of this decade of tension. And I think that more than a specific date gives us an understanding of what really frames the 50s. It was the time before the storm. That's in many ways, I think, how we think of the 1950s. And that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So let me tell you a little bit how I'm going to talk about the 1950s today. I'm first going to introduce the nuclear family to you, and you may scoff at this, thinking that I'm hardly the one to introduce you to the nuclear family, but I'll give you some details that may be new for you. I'll talk about the way in which the space and the place for nuclear families was built in the 1950s, and I'll talk about particularly women's lives in this new suburbia. I'll talk about the experiences of suburban men that were not entirely benign either. We'll talk about the youth and the way that they lived the 50s. And then we'll talk about some continuities that connect the 50s with the 1960s, particularly booze, drugs, and sex. And I promise we'll get to that as quickly as we can. Then we'll talk about some of our illusions about conservative values in the 1950s. What really did it mean to be Republican and conservative in the 1950s? And we'll take a final look at the reality of this civil rights era. I will promise, or rather I concede that we are not talking about everything that happened in the 1950s. The way we are framing this here cannot capture it all, but I think it captures maybe some of the strongest conflicts between the history of the 1950s and the memory of the 1950s. And then in the end, I hope that we may have sort of a free-flowing discussion about the way in which the misconceptions about the 1950s still reverberate through our popular culture and politics. So I want to show you at first this picture here of this nuclear family, and I wonder whether anyone can guess what this picture shows. Obviously, it shows a family, but can anyone figure out where they are? In a bunker. That's
Okay.
exactly right. They are in their nuclear fallout shelter, and according to the historian Elaine Tyler May, that's exactly in one of the dimensions in which we have to understand the family in the post-war years. There are a number of factors I'll talk about in a minute that give an economic foundation for the boom in family formation in the post-war years. But Elaine Tyler May, the historian, argues that one important way of understanding the family has to do with the fear of the outside world. In this particular image, it is very literally the fear of the outside world, because what's above ground is deadly. But even before this family assembled in the bunker, they lived in a world that had all sorts of dangers for them. Communists, so they were told, were lurking everywhere. The threat of a nuclear war was looming over their heads. Parents were afraid of the dangers that the kids were exposed to through popular culture. Men and women found city life increasingly morally compromised and dangerous. The corporate world for men was increasingly unpredictable. So there were a couple of dimensions of the post-war, and particularly the Cold War years, that made the outside life dangerous. And the answer that Americans in large numbers came up with was finding the family as the solution to this uncertainty. So the argument goes something like this, that really in the 30s, 20s, 1890s, 1910s, pick a decade, Americans would have found a variety of different enjoyments and meanings outside the family, in clubs, social organizations, political causes, activities, and social gatherings that made the family one important hub of social life, but not the only one. In the 1950s, families increasingly embrace their family, their institution, as the place where everything has to happen, where everyone needs to get their satisfaction in. Now, why was this possible to do in the post-war years? And here we come sort of to the phenomenon, the miracle that makes the baby boom happen. I often ask my students, what explains the baby boom after World War II? And I get some snickers and some laughs, and people don't really want to answer. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. When students come up with an answer, they will fall for this idea that it was the joy of reunion of soldier and the wife back home, that both had, loyally waited for each other, and now after 2 years of separation, romance was just shooting through the roof, and out of that came a surge in pregnancies. Now, if we had a 1 or 2 year spike in pregnancies, that would certainly be a sufficient explanation. But the reality of the baby boom was, of course, that it lasted for over 20 years. And you will concede that no relationship is so passionate as a result of 2 year separation that it can create that kind of a surge and such a demographic change. And we do see this. We see a spike in births after World War II go from a low of, let's say, in the 1930s, below 20 births per thousand to 27. Compared to that, by 1980, it was closer to 15. So we really have a significant surge in births. The reason this happened, the reason this baby boom was a real phenomenon, had to do with very boring economic structural factors. And this is the post-war prosperity that followed a generation of uncertainty. Think of the economic stabilizers that Americans benefited from as a result of the New Deal, the FHA amortized mortgage model of 30 years that gave you a predictable path to home ownership. Think of the predominance of union contracts that gave you a secure income and allowed a middle-class life even with a working-class factory job. Think of Social Security that meant that, or unemployment insurance that meant that you weren't going to get kicked to the curb in case of crisis, but were able to sort of maintain your place in life and in society. Think of the way in which World War II created economic opportunities and boosts, especially for men returning from the armed forces. The GI Bill was, of course, the most important factor here. It created free access to higher education, low interest rate guaranteed mortgage guarantees. It gave you preferred access to jobs. And then the Cold War in itself created a military-industrial complex that required more and more people in manufacturing jobs, high-end manufacturing jobs, especially in places like Southern California, from where I am talking to you. So there were all these economic structural factors that made family formation easy and possible. If you look at the marriage age of Americans, it dropped precipitously, or went down notably in the 1950s, because you could be a 23-year-old male and have a job stable enough to qualify you for a mortgage and allow you to buy a house. Today, I think if you tell our students that at the age of, for women, of 20 or 21, they're going to have their first child and live in their own suburban home, I think that's clearly very, that's not a likely scenario for many of them. And for men to believe that they can support their own family at the age of 24, that's a rare case. In the post-war years, in the 1950s, especially after some of the post-war economic uncertainty was overcome, that was a real scenario. Now, the idea that this nuclear family was somehow a restoration of a family, and let me go back here, let me show you this question, of a family that followed a Judeo-Christian tradition. I think that's a popular concept today, or has been for some time now, that the family was sort of the nuclear family was the standard that we wanted to return to. It's really mischaracterizing the way Americans have lived and experienced family through much of history. When you think of the 1930s, for example, where economic hardship created a lot of multi-generational families, this is something I think that some of your students may now be able to relate to when it comes to the Great Recession. I could see a lot of people knowing multi-generational families as a way of overcoming the economic uncertainty in the wake of 2008-2009. If you go into the 1940s, where you have to face families where husbands are generally overseas or away, where people have to board with family members because of a housing shortage, where women are in the workplace and kids are left with aunts, uncles, or distant relatives. These are all family models that are nothing like the nuclear family. And go back to the 1910s and the 1900s, and you have predominantly rural families that are far more extended and include many more people. Even if you go to the sort of most celebrated era of nuclear family life or domestic bliss in the 19th century, where people idealized the separation of spheres of men and women, well, that really built on the backs of either slaves in the South or poorly paid immigrant servants in the North. So the pictures that you see of a nuclear family in 1850 simply hides the fact that there was staff in the background that made this illusion possible. So this is how the traditional, in quotation marks, family of the 1950s was really more of a fluke, more of an anomaly than a return to familiar standards. Now, these families built their own environments and moved into their own neighborhoods. You have a picture here of move-in day and one of the subdivisions that sprung up across the United States in the 1950s and through the 1960s. Let me just check the numbers here. By 1960, I believe, the vast majority of white middle-class families actually lived in suburbs. I'm trying to find the number here. 68% of white households lived in suburbs by 1960. In 1940, it had only been 36%. So we see a big move of white middle-class family out of cities and into the suburbs. Again, remember the economic factors, the macroeconomic factors that make this possible, that create this certainty. Housing starts, were at phenomenal rates in the 1950s, up to 1.5 million new homes built every year, and people moved there in large numbers. This was the ideal setting for the idea that families really were contained social units where everybody was taken care of. If you can think of the alternative ways in which people lived in cities, they lived in apartment buildings. It didn't even have to be tenement buildings, but apartment buildings. They would have neighbors they could hear. They would have neighbors they would talk to or fight with in the staircase. Even more dense lots of single-family homes in cities meant that you knew much more of your neighbors, and your neighbors knew much more of you, and you were okay with that because that was part of your life. The suburban expectation was that the neighbors are on the other side of the fence, and that you can choose to socialize with them, but that is not really part of your daily experience. So the isolation, the containment of the family was really something that happened in the suburb, and the two were a perfect fit. Now, I think you're all waiting for the concession that this was somewhat exclusive an experience, because African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other Americans of color did not have the same opportunity to move into the suburb and find this kind of family containment, independently of whether they sought this actively or not. The picture that you see here is the picture of a wall in the 8 Mile district. There was a time when my students knew exactly what that meant because they knew hip-hop. And now I think, oh goodness, who is the artist who came from the 8 Mile district? Richard, can you help me? Richard, the expert on hip-hop? It's not Eminem. Thank you. Oh my goodness, what an embarrassment. Thank you, Jonathan. I should be familiar with that, shouldn't I? Well, now this is not so useful a popular reference anymore. But here's what happened in this on this plot of land. The owner of the land to the left went to the bank and wanted a loan to develop this into a subdivision with single-family homes. The bank drew on a map originally pioneered by the New Deal FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, that classified neighborhoods and evaluated their credit risk. And in the 1930s and into the 1940s, the federal agency judged mixed-race neighborhoods as higher credit risks because of social instability, higher rates of poverty, and so forth. So neighborhoods that had a mixed-race population were generally struggling to obtain loans for home improvement or really new construction. So this man's credit application got rejected, and what he did to solve that problem is he built a wall. That wall meant that the bank could draw a red line between the mixed neighborhood on the right and his land, and he got an affordable loan as a result. And this is really how, in the 1950s, we see the creation of an exclusive, not small, but exclusive white suburban enclave and an urban community that is increasingly associated with people of color. This is something that Americans in the 1930s and even in the mid-1940s would not have thought of, that the American city was somehow a place of color. In fact, the American city in the 20s and 30s was a place of work, play, political activism for white Americans just as for people of color. But this changed in the 1950s, and we have the origin of the association of urban with colors. Why did African Americans not move into suburbs? That had simply to do with the fact that they were not allowed to. I can tell you about a nearby subdivision and community here in California, Lakewood. They did not sell to African American home buyers. Levittown did not sell to African Americans. The Supreme Court case that invalidated racial covenants in home buying contracts only did that. It only invalidated them, but it didn't make them punishable by law. So realtors continued to rely on racial covenants where they asked home buyers to promise to sell to people of the same race. And into the 1970s, you actually see strong resistance in suburbs across the nation against the first African Americans or the first people of color moving in. If you're interested in reading a fascinating but admittedly somewhat depressing story about this, Anthony Lukács, Lukacs, wrote a book in the 80s, Common Ground, about the busing controversy in Boston. And it tells a story of an African-American middle-class family moving up, they believe, into a white suburb. And the backlash they receive is just incredible. Violent responses from otherwise peaceful suburban residents. So here we see the building of these very separate experiences of the 1950s. Now let's move into these suburbs and talk about...
Volker, if I could interrupt for a second. What was the title of that book again by Lukács?
Of course. Anthony Lukács, Common Ground.
Okay, let me just put that in here for our folks. And
I'm doing it right now too. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. We double. Okay, sorry for the interruption. Let's go to I Love Lucy.
Okay, not a problem. To talk about the way that that women experienced this suburban family life, I think a good entryway is actually I Love Lucy. Now, judging by some of the feedback that I heard from you, this may not mean anything to your students anymore, but I hope that it certainly means something for you. So when you think of Lucy, what sort of characterizes her? What's sort of her typical experience in these comedic episodes?
What's the typical experience? Surely you've seen I Love Lucy. This is on, I think it's on somewhere in the world, all 24 hours a day. Okay, the Candyline episode, dim-witted antics, scatterbrained. She's silly. Ricky is always the voice of reason. She's naive. She's unorganized.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. She's proper. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Funny. Childish. Yeah. Yep. Okay, what else do we have? Submissive.
Submissive?
Okay. Yeah, she's always, well, I'm not sure about that. She's always trying to break out. You know, she like the Candy episode, she was trying to get a job on her own and then she bungled it. And Ricky was always the blocking character. She's unfortunate. She's a troublemaker. In trouble always. She and Ethel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Volker. What do you make of these responses?
I think that they show sort of the two sides of Lucy. On the one hand, Lucy is the housewife, and she concedes that Ricky's the man of the house, and she doesn't want to mess with his authority. But at the same time, she has this belief that she too could make a name for herself, could be a star, could matter outside the home. And she tries this again and again, and as you all have said, she fails comedically, tragically sometimes, always to our entertainment, and certainly to the entertainment of audiences in the 1950s, who watch her try and fail. And it's one of the many ways in which 1950s TV, and also on many occasions radio, negotiated the tension between what women wanted and what men and many other women in American culture did not want to give her. Now, Richard, we have a clip here that you wanted to play us.
Listen,
Here we
before
go.
you go, what would the men of the house like for dinner tonight? I can't seem to think of anything different.
Oh, I don't care, honey. Just anything.
I don't care either.
Oh, you two are a big help.
All right, how about steak?
We had steak last night.
I like hot dogs.
Yeah, well, you had hot dogs night before last.
I like hot dogs every night.
You're telling me. Come on, Ricky, think of something, will you?
Honey, you decide. You can always come up with something good.
Oh, sure, I always come up with something good. I'm so sick of planning meals. Have you any idea how many meals I've cooked in the 18 years we've been married?
No. How many?
Well, now, let's see. 365 days a year, 3 meals a day. It's 15, 18, 19, 1,095 times 18 years. 30, 17, 20, say, 5, 6, 19,710 meals.
What about last Saturday night when we had dinner at the Ramses?
All right, 19,709 meals.
And what about all the times when we went out to restaurants or we were invited out to dinner?
So I got a few meals off for good behavior. Make it an even 19,000.
Good. That's exactly how many times you told me the same sad story.
Oh, well, I don't care. Being a housewife is a big bore. Cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds, dust the house. Cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds,
Hey,
dust
what
the
do you
house.
know? It says here that Danny Kaye is going to London to give another command performance of Queen Elizabeth.
I wonder what the Quinn is cooking for Phil tonight.
Oh, listen to this. Paul Douglas is starting a new television show early in the morning next week.
Well, goody, goody. I can watch Paul Douglas while I cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds.
All right,
Cook
enough.
the meals.
All right.
Maybe enough for you. I'm just getting warmed up.
Hi, Lucy.
Oh, hi, Ethel.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Fred.
Well, you ready to go to the market? Ethel, what are you having for dinner tonight?
With my allowance, anything that's on sale.
Fred, what would you like for dinner?
Somebody else is cooking.
Come on, get your shopping bag and let's go.
Why not? Go to the market, cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds.
What's eating her?
When you look at this, this is actually one of the more subversive scenes in I Love Lucy, because she really voices the discontent and even continues to complain after Ricky tells her to cut it out. There are many other TV scenes where that kind of complaining got a lot harsher response from husbands, and women submitted much more readily. It was a way in which Lucy allowed these discontents to be voiced without necessarily being a challenge to the household order. So she grumbles, she complains, she still does it. And so she gets her piece she gets to say her piece and then moves on. That was a good example. Many more times it's much more funny in the way that she tries to make a name for herself and when she tries to break out of this routine. A lot of women could relate to this sort of plight very readily because they had all been told to make room at the workplace after World War II and let men return to these opportunities. The tenor in America after the war was strongly that women needed to step back, and most women at the beginning of their war jobs were willing to do this and had intended to, but then war showed them what employment outside the home could mean in terms of having a fulfilled life in which you dealt with other matters other than, say, cooking, washing, etc. And women were reluctant to be pushed back, and they were pushed back aggressively. So they found themselves back in the home, and sometimes they found themselves back at the home with a college degree. Women at Barnard College, I believe, were told by the Democratic presidential hopeful Adlai Stevenson, who was the more liberal voice in the political spectrum, to use their college skills to make the home better for the husband and their children. It was their role to use this knowledge to maybe be more efficient in the delivery of the housework, to maybe cook more sophisticated meals, to make more out of the dollar so that they didn't have to rely on sales like we hear in this clip here. And women who were not ready to submit to this role of being second in command had a very hard time indeed. The pressure on women to marry and be at home was incredible. For women who refused to do this, they were often suspected of being lesbian, of being communist. Doctors thought that women who were refusing to marry or unwilling to have children probably required strong therapy. In fact, we have the application of electroshock therapy to women who feel that their future does not lie in marriage and in homemaking. At the same time that women were pushed into the home, they were also facing incredible... Yes?
Oh, I was just going to point out... yes. Judith Batten here compared Lucy to the Honeymooners, and for those of our participants who are not familiar with the Honeymooners, that was the Jackie Gleason show. He was a bus driver. They were kind of poor. They lived in an apartment in New York. Mm-hmm. And the roles were reversed, weren't they, Volker? I mean, the Jackie Gleason character was the one who was always trying to break out and improve his lot in life, and his wife Alice was always the voice of reality. She was always saying, face up to it. This isn't going to work. And the other thing I think that makes Lucy subversive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other thing that makes Lucy subversive is if you drop the Lucille Ball show into the context of other family sitcoms at the time. You have Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. Things like that. The housewife in those, and Father Knows Best, the housewife in those sitcoms was the very submissive, prim, proper, supportive housewife who never would voice the kind of discontent and resentment that you just saw in the Lucy clip. So that made, in the context, really sort of made that even more subversive.
Mm-hmm. I think the Honeymooners are an example of the way in which early sitcoms negotiated class conflict and the aspirations of working class men and the limitations. And here you have the negotiation of women's discontent in their new role. I was going to say that at the same time that women were pushed into the role of the homemaker, they also faced incredible suspicion. They had to make the home work for children and for husbands, and were also supposed to be happy doing so. So once women were sort of felt compelled by a lot of social pressure to marry and to go home, the question was always, are you first a wife or are you first a mother? And even though they were supposed to be moms, it was always emphasized that there had to be just as much wives, if not even more so. Because mothers, we see this here in one of the contributions, were praised for educating and elevating the family, but over-mothering was also the source of all sorts of social problems. So the tensions and the contradictions that women had to negotiate were really quite severe. It is that kind of a setting that prompted Betty Friedan to think about this problem that has no name, this isolation and solitude of middle-class women who find themselves stripped of so much in their life. In Elaine Tyler May's book, Homeward Bound, there is an excerpt of a woman who made a list of the price she had to pay for being a homemaker, and the list is really long. It starts with a way of life, meaning an easy one, so she gives that up. All friends of long duration, close relationships, gone. Independence and personal freedom, gone. What seemed to contribute to my personality, gone. Financial independence, gone. Goals for my own life, gone. My own idea as to the size of the family, gone, because the limited access to contraceptives, or in the case after contraceptive failed, abortion. Personal achievements changed completely. The close relationship with brother, mother, and grandmother, all these things were things that this woman saw she had to give up in order to be the housewife. And what she got in return was a list that turned out to be much shorter. The desire to give up all for the one you love, the husband, placing oneself last. I'm not sure in what way that is a real a gain. Personal satisfaction, if all turns out well, personal satisfaction in establishing a home. When you think of this description, this list, this is a depressing prospect. It's not entirely strange for us today, for those of us who know what it means to be at home and take care of the husband or the spouse, more generally, to take care of the children and have no other responsibility. It is a significant step away from the kind of opportunities that women enjoyed doing wartime employment. I'm going to put the title of the book out here for those who...
Great. Well, Cheryl writes, wives still do this sacrifice, but we own more stuff today, so we don't feel deprived. That's an interesting point, but the 50s, as we noted earlier, were a very consumerist decade. You had lots of new gadgets coming on, and the people who were the suburban housewives, like as Lucy is portrayed here, they had a lot of their stuff too. They that's a very comfortable home Lucy is living in right there.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that Betty Friedan and the fellow college graduates that she wrote about, that prompted her book, felt that they lacked prosperity. In fact, in many ways, the discomfort that they had with their own depression was that they lived in such good times. It was exactly what their parents and sometimes they themselves had fought for. Or had waited for during the Great Depression and during the war years. So they had it all, and yet it made them profoundly unhappy. Were they less connected than today? I think that is decidedly true, that the suburban enclaves at the time really separated women from each other and made it hard to feel like they were a part of a community. But I think even today, that if you are a spouse that is at home and committed to the care of 2 or 3 children, and remember in those days you really had a lot of children. Imagine a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old, and you take care of your husband and everything that he eats, consumes, takes to work, wears on his wears in terms of clothes and everything. That is a soul-sucking experience, I think, even today with a lot of the convenience that we have. And I think it explains why this model is so fraught with conflict. Now, what about the men in this new experience? They too came into the 1950s with memories of the war, sometimes of World War II, sometimes of the Korean War, of which this is a scene. If women resented being pushed back into the domestic life and out of wartime employment, men carried wartime experiences into the family with them that they didn't always that they couldn't always share in the way that they would have liked to. The kind of grief and fragility that we see in this picture is not something that you could readily share if people celebrated you as the hero, the person that saved the world from fascism. The greatest generation was not supposed to have psychological trauma. Today we know that PTSD was as common among World War II veterans and Korean War veterans as it was amongst Vietnam War veterans. But they were the winners, and they walked with wounds, physical often, even more often psychological, that really were not part of the winner's profile. And that created a deep disconnect for them. For those of you who saw the YouTube version of the movie, or the YouTube file of the movie, A Man in the Grey Flannel Suit, you have this illustrated quite strongly, that these men carry with them something that they really cannot shake, and something that alienates and separates them from their families. You may or may not have seen the movie Man in the Grey Flannel Suit. Here's a short excerpt from the book by Sloan Wilson, where he talks about the routine of men in this corporate America that dominates a middle-class life for men after the war. And if you take a quick look, I think you get a good idea of what the themes of this passage are. And I'd like to hear from you. What do you think are the themes of this brief passage?
Okay, Volker, why don't I read that and put it on the table for everybody?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Work in the office on Saturdays and do your background reading on Sundays. Hundreds do it. He glanced at his watch. It was only 11 o'clock. Suddenly he longed for the day to be over. He was ashamed to find that for no particular reason he felt exhausted, and he wanted to go home and relax. An hour and a half until lunch, and then another 5.5 hours before he could reasonably catch the train to South Bay. The big sweep hand on his wristwatch seemed to crawl with maddening slowness. Hopkins rarely left his office before 7 o'clock, and Tom had sensed he was annoyed to find that Tom usually left earlier. It was embarrassing to have to compete with Hopkins' hours. It was like taking a Sunday afternoon walk with a long-distance runner. The stereotyped notion of the earnest young man arriving early and leaving late, and the complacent boss dropping in for a few hours in the middle of the day to see how things were going, was completely reversed. Okay, so what are the themes of that passage? And our other question, what does that passage suggest about the meaningfulness of middle-class careers? Carolyn, a participant here, wrote earlier, you find that back on the screen. Let me get that one.
Yes, she said
writes,
that both
taking
had
care
soul-sucking experiences.
Yeah. And so I think that Sloan Wilson's passage here, I think, confirms what Carolyn was suggesting. So let's see what our participants have written. Just as women are supposed to find fulfillment in being a wife, a man is supposed to find fulfillment in being a worker. Seems that both made significant sacrifices. Those were the days when your career was your life, not just a job, as millennials consider it today. Feelings of dread, rat race mentality, marching through the days. Yeah, the theme here is boredom, it's ennui, shame, not living up to expectations. We have some other folks typing
I think
in.
it's, yeah.
So go ahead, Volker.
I think the lack of recognition and reward that men experience outside the home made their career so much less meaningful than they had anticipated themselves. This is a perfect illustration of why historians believe that there's a constant crisis in masculinity because of that lack of recognition, that sense of meaninglessness in work outside the home. This is something that begins in the 1890s and basically never disappears again. Both men and women made sacrifices. Both men and women had their discontents, but I think as much as we can say that both had this, the importance is still that when men returned home, they were in charge of their wives. They certainly claimed strong authority over their wives and over their children. And we'll see in a couple of slides what kind of dimensions that took. So men had a realm where they were, yes, Sean Rogers, king of the castle, and could sort of restore their sense of place. It's actually pretty clearly laid out in a promotional movie clip on the GI Bill that you can easily Google on YouTube when you put in GI Bill. It's about a 12-minute video clip done by the Veterans Affairs Bureau, where it shows a veteran sort of reorienting himself after war, and this GI Bill phenomenon is something that carries through the 50s. And at the very end, this veteran that they are showcasing comes back to his home, and out of the home steps a blonde young wife. And in this very hokey, fake, working-class tone, the actor, the narrator says, "Oh, and does everyone get one of these too? They ought to come with a house." And yeah, it's a joke, but it also shows the assumptions that men made very naturally, namely that everyone deserved a wife. And that, of course, is at the heart of the inequality between the two types of sacrifices. Now, men were supposed to get their satisfaction out of their home life as well, and they were supposed to play the role of the homemaker as well. Here you can see the men barbecuing. This is the way in which men could possibly participate in domestic chores, cooking meat outdoors. That sort of caters to their self-image of being, carnivore, savage, rough and ready in the outdoors. Of course, the backyard, and your wife makes your burger patties, and she started the grill and all. But it allows you to sort of to live your life and imagine yourself in fulfilling a masculine role. And today, yeah, we see this today when you guys ever watch HGTV, when men talk about their man cave in the house, where they need to have the place where they can be their savage self. The assumption that somehow men need to have sort of this place of escape where they can be wild because that's their nature, while women are not. I think speaks to a deep gender difference in the way we organize home life. This make satisfied? Was this all they wanted to? Well, sometimes, yes. I see a comment here, boys will be boys. That's another legacy of the 1950s, because men often were not too happy to be part of this 1950s pressure to be providers and fathers, be responsible. They want to do something else. Jack Kerouac did this in the 1950s. Instead of marrying and getting a job, he got on the road, he traveled, he met friends, he had short relationships, brief girlfriends, escapades, and then moved somewhere else. When you read On the Road today, it's not particularly revolutionary. I think many of our students will think, oh, yeah, that's a pretty normal story. But really, at the time, it was breaking conventions in the same way that it would have broken convention for a woman to insist on becoming a reporter and having her own life. So Jack Kerouac's On the Road is sort of setting the stage for the discontent that would erupt out in the open in the 1960s. It also shows the way in which men sort of rebelled by just refusing to embrace any kind of alternative manhood, but instead remain in an adolescent phase, which is why one historian has sort of blamed the 1950s for being the origin of sort of the Peter Pan complex, where men just sort of are so terrified of the responsibilities that come with manhood that they stay permanent adolescents. Men were supposed to get their sexual satisfaction. Yes.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you, but if we could go back to that other picture for just a moment, the cookout picture, slip back to that one. If I may make a comment, we're gonna talk about aprons in a minute, but I think the picture here really suggests the tension that's going on in men in the 50s. They are the cavemen. They're cooking out over the open fire, but look at the two there feminized wearing aprons.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this domesticity that sort of emasculates them, but yet there is this attempt to overcome that with this sort of, it's hardly cavemen and they're hardly open fires. So would that suggest the tension that's going on here in the 50s?
Yes, I think the negotiation of sort of some masculine core and the responsibility of having the man too contained in the family. I mean, the reason that Elaine Taylor May talks about the family as another form of domestic containment is clear here. These men are contained. The savagery is restrained to the barbecue. The apron keeps them from eat raw meat or something like that. I think this negotiation is visible in this image. You're right.
Yeah, Dave Faden makes an interesting point. Volker, if I could just get Dave's point in here. Dave writes, quoting Wallace Stevens, "Was Stevens being prescient when he wrote in Sunday Morning, 'Even in contentment I still feel the need for some imperishable bliss. Even though it doesn't fit contextually 100%, it seems like it might apply.'" Actually, Dave, I think it does fit contextually 100%. I think that sums up a good deal of the 60s. They need some imperishable bliss, which would take us on to that next slide that we were looking at. If you could move ahead, Volker, to On the Road and Playboy. Maybe not imperishable bliss, but
sorry.
Close, I suppose.
Right. Self-gratification beyond the family. That's really what it is here. If the expectation of the 1950s was that the family had to provide all satisfaction, women felt that it certainly did not, and that in many ways it oppressed them. Men didn't necessarily feel that the family oppressed them. The job did, the family didn't. But it didn't provide all their satisfactions either. They felt at times that their sexual satisfaction didn't take place in the home. Now, in fairness, often wives didn't feel sexual satisfaction in the family, in their marital relationship either. And men often felt that the requirement that they provide all sexual satisfaction to their wives put a lot of pressure on them. And it, in many ways, it demanded men to perform and be providers sexually in their marriage in the way that they often in reality just were not. That they imagined themselves or preferred to imagine themselves to be powerful, potent lovers, while in reality the stresses of daily life, the routine of taking care of the kids on the weekends and working an office job sapped a lot of that virility. And there's no accident that Playboy magazine appears in 1953, giving men a place in which they could imagine themselves to be as powerful, as potent, as in real life they just happen to be not. I think the pressure on men to perform their part in the contained family violated the reality that they too were actually fragile, sensitive, moody, yes, and imperfect human beings. So let me move to the youth here, if I can carry on. What was the 1950s like for youth? Well, I think at first sight we'd all like to go along with the title of the movie, Rebel Without a Cause, because what could youth in the 1950s possibly complain about? It's, in retrospect, a nice decade to grow up. Certainly if you're a white middle class and grew up in suburbs, there is some reality to the illusion, to the suggestion that growing up in these suburbs was a safe and nice experience. But the thing that started to disappear in the 1950s was the path from youth to adulthood. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was still often a job, a responsibility outside the family or within the family that gave responsibility to young adolescents and gave them a way in which they could imagine themselves to not be kids anymore. The prosperity of the 1950s took a lot of this away. young people still had jobs, but they were often, I would say, youth segregated, where they encountered jobs and people in jobs that were also teenagers, where they remained in sort of adolescent subservient roles. And James Dean's frustration is his inability to see how he can make it from an adolescent to an adult. The anxiety that the 1950s experienced about youth had something to do amongst youth feeling that sort of lack of path forward themselves, but it also had just as much to do with Americans generally fearing paranoid about whether the family could deliver on delivering mature adults. And here the blame fell entirely on women. It was over-mothering that created deviant youth. It was outside the family popular culture that made people paranoid about criminality. Comics seemed to be the source of all evil in the 1950s, in the way that rock and roll was perceived as well. And if you have lived through the 90s, the anxiety about the way hip-hop lyrics were supposed to threaten American youth. So there's continuity here from the 1950s onward, but it begins in the 1950s, this anxiety about the family not delivering on the job of creating mature adults. Do we have time to play this clip, or shall we move forward in the interest of time?
Volker, actually, we don't have this clip. I hope we did send it out to everybody. I hope everybody had a chance to look at it. And let's ask if people did get a chance to look at it and see what they think, because it was a very telling clip. If you remember, Jim Backus, the father there in the apron, comes in. His son is lying in bed, and he asks his son what's wrong. His son has just been beaten up, and the son wants to talk to his father. And his father, lets him down. Anybody want to tackle some of those discussion questions? What issue does Jim raise with his father? What is he seeking? How is the father portrayed? How does the father respond? How does Jim react? Thurston Howell in an apron, right? They found his way back from Gilligan's Island. Okay, any takers on those questions? Let's see. He asked him if you recall, when the father comes in, his father appears weak as a man. When his father comes in, the son wants to talk about honor, very masculine topic, and the father simply is he first of all, he's feminized. He's wearing an apron, and he can't respond. He doesn't ignore the son. He deflects the question. He says, "Well, let's make a list," and then the son rejects that, and the father says, "Well, if we can't figure out your problem, ask for advice." So the father lets him down entirely. So I think your point, Volker, about that bridge between youth and adolescence disappearing, I think that is well illustrated in this scene, because that bridge, the father completely fails in his masculine role and completely lets his son down. Let's see what some of our responses are. The father just wants to make a plus delta list. Jim just wanted to know how to be a man precisely, and how would he know what to do. The father has not been parenting his son all along, and now when faced with a potential life-altering situation can offer him nothing of substance. Dad doesn't know what to tell him. Yeah, good readings of the scene.
If I can jump in here, this also speaks to the theme that historians have called sort of a fear of momism, that the overbearing presence of mothers, and this is contradictory, I recognize, because women were asked to be just that, but the overbearing presence of moms in raising children and in dominating the household, people feared was emasculating men. You see the man in the apron, and it was not doing what it had to do for youth. And someone earlier said, could you please elaborate on the failures of moms? And I wonder whether I gave the wrong impression here. I'm not saying that moms failed. What I'm saying is that people at the time blamed mothers for the problems of society. That if young men committed crimes, it was mothers, the mistake of mothers. And the failure of husbands to be fathers had to do with the overbearing presence of mothers, because what the husband does here is basically just extend a role of mother rather than be sort of a counterweight, a counterbalance. So it speaks, I think, to the deep sexist perception of mothers at the one hand being required to be there, but at the same time also being blamed for the work that they do at home.
Yeah. Jeanette Lennon makes a really good point here. I remember that in the scene, and it didn't occur to me to put any meaning on the fact that when the boy runs out of the house, he stops to take a piece of cake, something a little boy would do, and that piece of cake, of course, links him to the mom in the family. Yeah, very, very insightful, Jeanette. A little boy trying to become a man with no one to show him how. Yep, sounds like Rebel Without a Cause to me.
Well, and you can see here the continuity into the 1960s, where people then start to talk about single-family homes and the disaster that this threatens on American society, that when men are not in the home, or when men at home are not men, that it all falls apart. So despite the fact that women were asked to carry the burden at home and cook the 19,000 meals and wash and clean and raise the son, in the end, if the man isn't there, it all goes to pot. Now that, of course, is a mischaracterization of what really happens, because single mothers did phenomenal work, and the women of the 1950s, the mothers that did the work at home, should not carry the collective blame for youth delinquency, which incidentally was not all that dramatic after all. But I think it speaks to the high pressure on what the family was supposed to do and how women were supposed to carry the family. I think with that we can maybe move forward.
Yes, let's move ahead. We've got about 20 minutes.
Right. Now, when we try to draw a contrast between the 1950s and the 1960s, we often fall into the trap of thinking of the 1950s as a somewhat more wholesome world, where the ills, the social ills, and the excesses of the 60s counterculture were somehow not present. And I think a lot of youth, people who grew up in the 90s or in the 2000s, even in the 80s, may have heard from their parents or later grandparents that somehow theirs was a cleaner time, a more innocent age. But that you really have to put into a new context when you think about the way in which booze, drugs, and sex were part of life in the 1950s. Now, it may not have been that spring break parties in Cancun went into excess in the 1950s, but in other socially contained settings, again, I think containment is a key term here, the abuse of alcohol and drugs was all too common. Sloan Wilson, actually, in his book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, talks a good deal about the way in which liquor was sort of a lubricant for middle-class careers. You had to go in the morning and have your first drink at the 10 o'clock meeting. You would have a drink with lunch. You would take a nap, then you would have an afternoon drink, and after work, happy hour would be followed by a drive home where you would have another drink. So the whole day was set with different kinds of liquor routines that made drinking a real problem in middle-class America in the 1950s. Now, if we concede that cigarettes are a drug and unhealthy, then I think we can already rest our case and say that the 1950s were really the age of drug abuse. But we can also go beyond the omnipresence of cigarettes and look at the way in which people use psychopharmaca. Now, I will confess to you that this ad that I'm showing here on the right is actually from the 1960s. Oxazepam, I think, only was marketed starting in 1965. But the theme actually pairs with what happened in the 1950s a lot, and that was the use of amphetamines and methamphetamines. A lot of this was introduced first during World War II, when soldiers needed to find ways to stay awake, say for 3 days straight. It then became part of a trucker culture, but then also quickly found its way into households where housewives received antidepressants or speed and other boosters that helped them go through the drudgery of that life. And when you look up there at the title of that ad, you can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. What does it say to you? What's your reaction there?
Okay, what's our reaction? You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. I like the way the handles of the mops and the broom form a prison, a jail cell for her. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got multiple attendees typing in. I wonder why you can't set her free. And she's obviously entrapped by homemaking the way Lucy was. She's stuck in her life, but drugs can help her get by. I wonder who this ad is aimed at. I mean, is this for men?
Well, that's really
the beginning of Prozac, which are happy. Valley of the Dolls popped into my mind. Can't solve her problems, but can take away the symptoms. You can't set her free because her place is in the home. What do you make of these responses, Volker?
Well, I think that's key. I think what you said there is really the secret. It speaks to the man. You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. It doesn't talk to her. It talks over her. And I think that is sort of at the crux of this problem. It's, of course, drug abuse is a problem, but if women say, "Look, I can't take this anymore. I need something," that's one thing. But if husbands say, "Look, I need something to keep her contained. I'm going to give her this. That's going to make her work." That's a whole different story. Drugging yourself is still a whole lot better than having your husband drug you so they can carry through. Yes, and I think Jenny is right. It totally talks over her, disregards her as a thinking, intelligent person. And I think that's at the core of the problem here. I will tell you, I have 2 children, and I've had times where I would have to take care of them, say, 2 days straight. And while I didn't take oxazepam or methamphetamines, a beer at the end of a long day with 2 little children, I cannot blame anybody. But if I were to go home to my wife and say, "Here, you should take this so you're not so grumpy," I think that'd be a whole different story. And that's why I don't do it. Now, here we have an excerpt from the Daily Beast, and I think it highlights the place of alcohol in the 1950s. Richard, you discovered this item, right?
Yeah, Time Life in the 50s and 60s was famous for its alcohol culture, and you have the testimony here that it really was a kind of Mad Men culture. And of course, there was the drink cart and the food being delivered. This was in the old building, 9 Rockefeller Plaza, where we were until 1959. I don't remember the drink cart so much in the new building on closing nights, which for Life, that's magazine, Life magazine. Back then was Saturday. First, a cart would go by with wine and liquor and mixed drinks. Then that was followed by a French meal from a French restaurant directly across the street. They would load up these special carts with receptacles for food to keep it warm, and they would come by and feed you. This was a closing night ritual. First the drink cart, then the food. So Mad Men was in the world of the media, at any rate, in New York City. Mad Men was a fairly accurate description of what went on, and this just shows the place of alcohol, even in the workplace. I mean, it was perfectly acceptable. Yes. In fact, it was provided by your employer.
Right, and it was judged very differently in middle class context compared to, say, working class context, where the beer on the construction side got much more condemnation than the whiskey at the 10 o'clock meeting. Now, I'm going to move ahead in the interest of time, if that's okay, because I want to talk also about sexual morality in the 1950s. A lot of you will know the Kinsey Report and the revelations that it made about the true sexual diversity that happened behind closed doors. Again, the family as a containment unit is a useful way of thinking about this, because if you were gay, or if you simply had no sexual desire for women, if something else made you tick, you had to somehow fit in. You were a suspect if you were unmarried. 90% of Americans thought that you could not possibly be happy if you were unmarried in the 1950s. So if you were unmarried and in your 30s, people would ask questions. So that meant that you had to be in a marriage, and that family contained actually hid a lot of what really happened in American sexual experiences. The other thing that families hid, though, was sort of the dark side of family intimacy, and that was sexual violence and violence more generally. Interestingly, in the 1950s, sociologists almost do not touch the issue of violence in the family. There's no article between, I think, 48 and 60 in 1960 that even touches on the issue, as if it doesn't exist, if this is invisible. Even though in the 1950s a beauty pageant winner came out and revealed that she had been sexually abused persistently by her father from age 5 until 18 when she left for college. That was the exception that sort of broke the code of silence on this. When you see this little newspaper clip here that I found, where men talked whether a woman should be spanked, they all agree that if it teaches the right lesson, a woman deserves to be spanked. This makes me think that in many ways, it's not so much that it's false to think that 1950s suburban family life tried to keep people from the dangers of the bigger world. It did that. But what it did just as much, or even maybe even more so, that it kept the dangers of the family from the outside world. So yes, we lived a somewhat sheltered life, but the sheltered life also hid the true reality of what it meant to live in suburban families. Whether it was the discontent of women, the frustration of youth not knowing how to grow up, or the misgivings about their limited powers that men had in the family. I think all these dark sides of the family life were hidden. Maybe that's really the best way of thinking of the containing family. Now, I want to show just two more dimensions of...
Volker, if I could just jump in for a moment. We had a question earlier. If we could go back to that slide with the Kinsey study on it. Carolyn asked, when we were talking about male sexuality, Carolyn asked if there were any data available on male sexuality in the 50s. So that's one question. And the other question is, how accurate was the Kinsey report? Is that something we could trust?
No, it was overstated. There was a clear, strong desire to show and maybe break the spell of heterosexual normativity that the Kinsey researchers pursued, and I could say that maybe some of the data was sort of deliberately pushed towards that agenda. I do think that the Kinsey report suggests heterosexual men's openness to, at some point in their minds, think about homosexual encounters. It talks about heterosexual men's insecurities, experiences of failing performance, impotence, and all those things. Issues that otherwise, of course, you would never get to hear about. Do we have data on the amount of men who failed to please their wives in the 1950s? No, but I think you can let sort of more even more careful research on sexuality tell you that men live with an illusion of themselves that they just have a hard time living up to. I think that was true maybe for the first time in the 1950s, and that's almost certainly true today.
Right. So Carolyn asks, wasn't most of the sample for the Kinsey report basically from a male prison population?
Yes, I will tell you that I don't know the details of the Kinsey report right now. The sample from the male prison population could skew the results somewhat, but the idea that somehow men in prison also come with a more checkered or more diverse sexual history, I think that would be misreading the relationship between sexuality and criminality or imprisonment. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily a big problem. And even if we make concessions on the scale of the findings, at the time it was shocking, and had all the numbers just been true by half, it still would have utterly dismantled the notion that Americans were heterosexual in the 50s, and then the 60s discovered sexual diversity, and people sort of turned to a new lifestyle. If we sort of pick up a more conservative jargon.
Yeah, well, all those babies and the baby came from somewhere. So shall we move ahead to Republicanism?
Well, they came from somewhere. Yes. So just two quick points I want to make about some misconceptions on the 1950s. And one is that the 1950s were conservative. They were conservatives in the way that they were politically more timid, that people were far more afraid of being labeled communist and steered clear from excessively liberal proposals. Anything that had the word social in it was a dangerous thing to touch. But it wasn't a conservative time period in which, say, free market ideology reigned unmitigated. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then president, had been no fan of the New Deal, but he also knew that this was nothing that he could dismantle, and that he was going to undo his party if he tried to do this. And he pushed back conservatives within the Republican Party that went in that direction. In the 1960s, that would happen. Barry Goldwater would be far more radical in his propositions. Ronald Reagan would follow him in that lead. And the Young Americans for Freedom, by all accounts, were actually a bigger organization, youth organizations in the 60s than the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, and they were asking for a radically libertarian kind of economic order. But in the 1950s, this was really not a standard. If you think of Eisenhower and his economic policies, especially the Highway Act of 1956, he was a New Dealer through and through. And if we're looking back to sort of a Republican era, the 1950s, and the Republicans' ideal today could not be further apart. And here I think we have the example of Barry Goldwater just taking a new step. We can basically make the argument that the end of the 1950s and the open conflict came not only from the left, it came also from the right. If it's okay with you, Richard, I'm going to skip this piece to make one quick final point because we're running out of time very quickly here.
Sure, go right ahead.
I finally want to make a point that I think our students need to learn about what it meant to be fighting for civil rights. It's so easy today to look back and, once a year, listen again to the I Have a Dream speech from 1963 and be inspired by hope and optimism and the prospect of change. I think what that doesn't show is the grim reality of the sacrifices people had to make to fight for civil rights. Just look at the teenager here going to school in Little Rock in 1957, the angry mob she had to defy. Could you imagine yourself in that position? Could you imagine yourself campaigning and trying to get voters to register in Mississippi under the threat of death and maybe once a while be able to register one person? Could you imagine 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education Still have politicians speak for segregation now, segregation forever. Indeed, in 68, 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 20 years after the integration of the armed forces, have people promise and campaign for segregation now, segregation forever. Fighting for civil rights was a comparatively thankless work that rarely got you the recognition at the time. And if our students today know that working for the right thing, working for social change, does not come with awards, but only possibly 50 years later will get someone else the credit, I think we may give them a better dose of reality. But on the other hand, we don't want to discourage them either. So I think what I want to conclude with, we have very little time here, is to ask what your questions are, what you are thinking of this. Do you think that we still suffer from a misunderstanding of the 1950s in our popular culture and in politics?
Okay. How do the 1950s figure into popular culture and politics today? Do we misunderstand them? Do they stand for something they weren't? See, Brent and Mary are writing in. Let's see what they have to say. I think we look back, as we saw in the beginning of the webinar, we look back with great nostalgia. We tend to idealize it. We think, yes, it is still stereotyped a bit. Yeah, it's a period that, from this distance, looks quite stable, quite secure. It has been held up as the zenith of the 20th century, and some people think everything went downhill from the 1950s. We know it through firsthand accounts of our elders. What other comments we have coming in? Let's see. I think people still idealize it. Idealize the time. Our students, I believe, see it with a more critical eye. Would have liked to talk about the music of the period, strongly influenced by the media. Volker, what do you make of these responses?
Yeah, I think there is still sort of a lingering sort of embrace of the 1950s as somehow a good time. And in terms of economic reality, that is true. I think what I tried to show here was that while things seemed to go openly haywire in the 1960s, the reality of life within the family was fraught with conflict, unspoken violence, and quite a bit of isolation and suffering. Now, this is not to say that there was nothing good about the 1950s, and I think your music would have been a good example of this, and the way in which it broke down racial barriers, so that things happen in the 1950s that, give us no reason to be depressed about the decade, but some of the celebration of this as the era of the family, I think that's a particularly false notion. When you ask the men about what it really was like, when you ask the women what really was it like to be the homemaker and youth, I think you need to embrace the fact that this idealization of the family is really it's a crucial problem, and it makes us aspire to something that ultimately wasn't a historical reality on the inside in the 1950s, and was really a fluke experiment in broader American history.
Mm-hmm. Okay, ladies and gentlemen,
and yes, Melody, I can totally understand people being happy to have grown up in the 1950s. But, again, I'm not trying to make the entire decade look something different.
Right. Yeah, I think if you grew up in some families, white, middle class, affluent families in some places, sure. My own family was pretty blessed in the 50s. Sure, but this webinar tonight has made us question some of the stereotypes and some of the nostalgia that has grown up around the decade. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our webinar. Are there any final comments, questions before we wrap things up? Cheryl writes, "Kids were better. Kids are always better in the past." Ladies and gentlemen, please join us next week for our next webinar, 7 p.m., Thursday, March 24th, Religious Freedom and Religious Intolerance in America. Before we move ahead to that one, let me thank Volker for a very interesting webinar tonight. Thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of questions to ponder. Thank you, Volker.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And I want to thank our participants for joining us tonight. Please don't forget our upcoming webinar next week, 7 p.m., March 24th. We'll be looking at religious freedom and religious intolerance. Please submit your evaluations and then print out your CEU documentation of participation so you can get certification credit for the webinar. Thanks again for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you, I hope, next week. Take care and good evening.